Meredith once said, "The right combination is between a free economy and social policy that addresses the needs of society and creates equal opportunity." Because I agree with his statement, I affirm the resolution. The United States has a moral obligation to adopt a single-payer healthcare system. In order to evaluate the resolution, we must establish the obligations of a government, so morality is the paramount value. Applied to government, actions are only moral if they are fair to the citizens of that government. So the obligation a government has to its citizens is to ensure a fair society. John Rawls' theory of justice gives the criteria to determine what is fair and why. Rawls's veil of ignorance, a position from which the principles of justice should be developed. From this neutral perspective, those deliberating about the principles would not know what socioeconomic status, race, religion, or gender he or she represents. Because the perspectives of the participants are neutral, those deliberating would create principles that guarantee protection to every group regardless of status. Rawls argues for the first principle of justice, the equal liberty principle, which says that each person is to have an equal right to the most extensive scheme of basic liberties, compatible with a similar scheme of liberties for others. His second principle, the difference principle, reads that the social and economic inequalities are to be arranged so that they are to be of the greatest benefit to the least advantaged members of society, and that offices and positions must be open to everyone under conditions of fair equality and opportunity. Both of these principles aim to minimize the harms and disadvantages to those in the most difficult positions. In a well-ordered, just society, we are either born to an advantaged class, or we are protected by the government which compensates for our disadvantage. Rawls sums it up by writing, "The principles of justice are chosen behind a veil of ignorance. This ensures that no one is advantaged or disadvantaged in the choice of principles by the outcome of natural chance or the contingency of social circumstances. Since all are similarly situated and no one is able to design the principles to favor his particular condition, the principles of justice are a result of fair agreement or bargain." Thus, I first contend that a single-payer healthcare system upholds the equal liberty principle. My first subpoint is that the current system violates the equal liberty principle. When someone is denied access to healthcare because under the current healthcare system, when someone is denied access to medical care under the current healthcare system, the equal liberty principle is violated because she is denied access to a basic scheme of liberties, that is, protection of the right to life. According to the United States Census Bureau, 14.2% of the U.S. population was uninsured from 2010 to 2014. This doesn't even reflect the number of people who have fee-for-service insurance but can't pay for it. According to the National Healthcare Quality and Disparities Report, gaps in healthcare quality are particularly acute for certain racial, ethnic, and socioeconomic groups. Blacks and Hispanics experience worse quality of care for approximately half of the quality measures reported. Hispanics and Asians experience worse care for approximately two-thirds of access measures. Poor people experience worse care for approximately two-thirds of the quality and access measures. The truth is, health disparity in the U.S. is a huge problem. The current system effectively violates the equal liberty principle, making it unfair and immoral. Furthermore, untreated medical conditions, both physical and mental, can significantly prevent future expressions of liberty. For example, untreated illnesses can impair the ability to further education or business interests. My second subpoint is that a single-payer system would uphold the equal liberty principle. A single-payer healthcare system would allow for some chance to survive illness that they would not have been given otherwise. David de Grazia writes in his essay, "Single-Payer Meets Managed Competition, the Case for Public Funding and Private Delivery," that what a system of multiple insurers has to do is quite different from what we require of a single payer. Profit-making is not a goal of the enterprise. Breaking even is just fine. There is no need for competitive advertising because there is only one system. Everyone is permanently eligible for services, eliminating in one stroke much unnecessary bureaucracy. There is no need for experts to decipher the rules and regulations of different payers because the single payer will apply the same rules to all enrollees. A single payer system takes the inequality out of healthcare, which means that the system is able to provide for the least advantage. My second contention is that a single payer healthcare system upholds the difference principle. My first subpoint states that the current healthcare system violates the difference principle. Lack of access to mental health services perpetuates the cycle of poverty. A study published in the Journal of Psychiatric Medicine in 2007 concludes, based on statistical analysis, that those in poverty in the U.S. were much less likely to receive mental health care than their counterparts in Ontario or the Netherlands, both of which have a single-payer system. Furthermore, a separate study entitled "The Effect of Mental Distress on Income" finds that the relationship between mental illness and poverty appears to be self-perpetuating. Low income prevents the mentally ill from gaining access to mental health services to obtain treatment for their illness, and mental illness substantially reduces earnings potential. My second subpoint, that is single-payer healthcare system satisfies the difference principle. Single-payer healthcare necessitates taxation in order to provide equal healthcare. This inequality is structured to benefit the least advantaged and therefore satisfies the difference principle. There can be no doubt that a single-payer system both best empowers the disadvantaged to improve their circumstance. While no society will ever be perfect, a just society will always strive to minimize the damage of its imperfections. Variable payer health insurance has disastrous consequences for the poor and disadvantaged in society. Because the single-payer system guarantees the same basic scheme of liberties for all people and structures inequality to benefit the least advantaged, it is a moral obligation.
Could you please repeat your criteria?
My value is morality upheld by John Rawls' theory of justice.
So then what would be your other?
Justice is fairness.
Okay, justice is fairness. And you said that's upheld by the two principles of justice.
Mm-hmm.
And these two principles are the equal liberty and the difference principle, correct?
Mm-hmm.
Which of these would you say is more important?
They hold the same importance.
But when the two...
They're both criteria for for an action to be considered fair.
Okay.
So if one is
Let me rephrase the question. If one of them is in conflict, or if both of them are in conflict, which should be upheld first?
How could both of them be in conflict?
Well, say we can either allow people to have equal liberties to all or advantage the lower class. Hypothetically, which would you say we should do?
If both of them can't be fulfilled, then the action is not just, it's not fair, it's not moral.
Okay. And
But I don't see a situation in which they could come into conflict with each other.
okay. And you stated that the current system violates the difference principle, correct?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And you stated that the current system violates the equal liberty principle, correct?
Yes.
But okay. What would constitute a legitimate government?
A legitimate government?
Yes.
A government that ensures, or that's the policies that it implements both uphold the John Rawls theory of justice. So, example, a government that institutes a single-payer healthcare system.
So
That's, if a government is legitimate, they have a moral obligation to provide policy that treats all of its citizens fairly, to ensure fairness in society.
So, for a government to be legitimate, it would have to, under your criterion here, it would have to uphold both your principles.
Yeah. Yes.
Okay. And both of them must be upheld equally, and if one is not being upheld, then it would be...
I don't understand. I don't think it's really a proportional thing of how they're upheld. They're either upheld or they're not. It's black and it's white.
If one of these principles is not upheld, it would be unjust, or if both of these, correct?
Yes.
Okay, thank you. No further questions. Okay. I stand in firm negation for the resolution. The United States ought to adopt a single-payer healthcare system. My value for today will be government legitimacy. The government has a specific contract it must adhere to, and when a government steps outside the boundaries given to it by the people, it ceases to become a legitimate government. The criterion will be adherence to the social contract. Locke describes the state of nature, or a society lacking a governing body, as a state of perfect equality, with no laws but one, the law of nature. The law of nature states that no one ought to harm another in his life, health, liberty, or property. The only exception to this is when it conflicts with our own preservation. This exception is the right of nature, which is the right to punish a transgression of his rights to prevent further transgression of rights. In the state of nature, each man serves as a judge and a jury in a state of war, meaning that if I subjectively feel threatened, I have the ability to protect myself, and there is no government or police force to stop me. if I'm acting unjustly. The allowance for every person to punish any measure of transgression with whatever retaliation he or she deems fit would lead to a constant state of war, and is why people would want to create and enter into a society. Unlike the state of nature, in this society the government would have a monopoly on coercive force, so as to eliminate the constant state of war in a state of nature. The citizens maintain every other right, namely life, liberty, and property, but the government assumes the right to use coercive force over another, that is, to protect and punish. This is the government's sole obligation, to protect the rights of the citizens. When a government ceases to uphold the social contract and to protect the rights of the citizens, it fails to be a legitimate government. Contention 1. A single-payer healthcare system violates property rights. This system of healthcare oversteps the bounds of its social contract, as it takes the property of the citizens who established it. As John Locke writes in the Two Treatises of Government, they, the deputies, must not raise taxes on the property of the people without the consent of the people, given by themselves or their deputies. With the amount of funding necessary for a single-payer healthcare system, taxes would have to be raised on citizens without their consent. This redistribution of property by the government violates the rights of the people and fails to adhere to the social contract, which constitutes a legitimate government. One has a right to his or her property, and what he or she decides to do with it is a right. However, a single-payer system takes that property and gives it to another, which is violating the basic definition of property rights. Therefore, a single-payer healthcare system fails to adhere to the social contract and fails to be a legitimate government. Contention 2. A single-payer healthcare system violates liberty. The authority given to the government is limited to coercive force to protect citizens' rights. But with a single-payer system, the government is taking the liberty of the people. The government, by establishing a single-payer system, would be taking the ability for one to choose what type of healthcare he or she would want to buy with his or her money. A person who works so much gets paid for his or her labor, and that person has the right to decide where to spend that money. The government does not have the right to regulate how one spends his or her money, yet having a single-payer system forces everyone to have one standard of healthcare, and there are lots of people who would want to buy better healthcare, and lots who would want to sell it. Allowing the government to limit one's economic liberty and restrict how one spends his or her property is the same as allowing one to take away political liberties, because the government is infringing upon one's ability to exercise his or her liberty, whether politically or economically. Having this violation of liberty would be a violation of the social contract, and the government would cease to be a legitimate government. Now moving on to my opponent's case. Her value was morality, which she defined, and she stated that actions are only moral if they are fair. Yet, as I have stated in my case, a government is only a legitimate government when it follows the contract that is set up by the people when they are exiting the state of nature and entering into a society. Because government specifically exists because people would want their rights protected, not simply because of fairness. The whole point of setting up a government is so people are not transgressing on others' rights and simply deciding by themselves and being their own judge when someone has taken their rights. And my opponent stated that her value criterion was the two principles of justice. And in her first contention, she stated that the single-payer healthcare system would allow both of these principles to be upheld. Yet, this is not true because the single-payer healthcare system does not allow the equal liberty principle to be upheld. Because the equal liberty principle states that a basic scheme of liberties needs to be accessed to all. Yet, as I have stated, under the single-payer healthcare system, it denies the property, or it denies two of the three basic liberties that the government is supposed to be protecting. It violates the property of the people and the liberty of the people. And since the government is failing to do this under the single-payer system, then it would cease to be a legitimate government. And under my opponent's own criterion of fairness, she states that both of these principles need to be upheld, yet the equal liberty principle is simply denying basic liberties to the higher class of society who would presumably have to pay higher taxes and would have their property taken away from them and given to other people, which is simply unjust because it is a specific right that the government is designed and tasked to protect that they must adhere to. And under the affirmative system, where everybody would simply have the same health care, it's denying the property of people and the liberty to decide what they would like to do with it. So therefore, under the single-payer system, it ceases to become a legitimate government. And for her second contention, saying it satisfies the difference principle, well, my opponent stated that it needs to uphold both of these principles or it fails to be a just system. And as this system denies two basic liberties to its people, it fails to be a moral government, a fair government, or a legitimate government. And for these reasons, I can only see a negative ballot on today's resolution.
I guess we can start now. Okay, can I get your interpretation of the first principle of justice, the equal liberty principle?
I believe you stated that it's the basic scheme of liberties, such as health, property, liberty.
Well, right, or
the right to life,
liberty,
and property need to be available to all, correct?
Okay, yeah. But can I ask you, how does your system provide for the right to life?
What do you mean?
Okay, you say you need to uphold all three in order for the government to be considered legitimate. However, you only look at property and liberty. Two, I would argue, that can only exist with life.
Well, I'm not saying that healthcare would not be able to be accessed. I'm just saying we shouldn't allow everybody to have one system of healthcare and for it to be paid out of the pockets of the people.
Okay. Now I'm going to move on to your case because, your entire idea of how the citizens cannot be taxed without consent, correct?
Yes.
Okay, so what about people who send their children to private schools but still have to pay for public education? Would you say that public education is, or makes the U.S. government illegitimate?
I would say that the government's job is to uphold the property, the life, and liberty of the people, and if the education violates that, then yes, it would cease to be a legitimate government.
Okay, but wouldn't you say that our society is better for public education?
I'm not arguing if it's better for education. I'm simply saying the government has to adhere to the contract that the people created.
Okay, so why does making sure that these three liberties in extreme are held above trying to progress our society?
Well, because if we're taking the basic rights of people, I wouldn't think it's a very progressive society if we are allowed to take the property of the people simply so that the government can do whatever it wants with it.
Okay. And I want to talk more about your social contract. So what if I didn't want to enter into the social contract? What if I didn't want to have to pay taxes because I want to be protected?
And don't enter into the society.
But don't we enter into the society by tacit consent when we get a driver's license? What if I still need to be able to drive, but I don't want to pay taxes, I just want to defend myself?
Well, what is tacit consent?
Tacit consent is where you agree to live in a society, but you do so by exercising the liberties that society gives you.
Oh, well then, if you don't want to be in that society, then don't exercise the liberties or leave the society.
But what if I need to drive?
If you need to drive, then
I'm just saying, it doesn't seem like a very pragmatic approach to how we should deal with human liberty. Can you?
Well, I suppose you would see how it's pragmatic approach, but I think it's very pragmatic.
I would like to ask you how so, but the round today comes down to the question of government legitimacy. What makes a government legitimate? So I'd like to start out by first going over again why I feel that my government is more legitimate than a government that protects all the liberties of the citizens to extremes. So justice is fairness. I think my opponent actually misinterpreted the equal liberty principle. Note the phrasing, everyone has basic rights compatible with the same scheme of rights for others. What I take this to mean is that in order to provide for all of the rights to life, liberty, and property, you're going to need to be alive. Okay? And my opponent looks at it and he says, okay, no, we just need to protect property and liberty to the extreme so that no infringement of these under his government, his legitimate government, no infringement or transgression of these happens by the government. So again, if everyone has basic rights compatible with the same scheme of rights, it has to be compatible. So I don't really think that just having the rights to property and liberty, but being dead it doesn't really show the compatibility here with others. So if I am dying of starvation and there's someone who has tons of expendable money and they get taxed by the government to pay for my health care, I don't think that that's an infringement of their rights. I just think that's more of a compatibility of the basic scheme of rights. My opponent doesn't take into account that my opponent doesn't think that his idea of government legitimacy transgresses the three basic rights that he seems to want to uphold. However, he doesn't do that because by not giving health care to everyone, or by not providing for health care for everyone through consent to be taxed, as he says, he's not providing for the basic scheme of liberties compatible with that for all people. He also, during cross-ex, we talked about public education and how I would say that the United States is better for public funding of education. However, he believes that because the United States taxes its citizens, it's an illegitimate government. I don't see how providing, again, under the under the two principles of justice, it isn't a legitimate government. The two principles of justice are derived from the veil of ignorance. So the veil of ignorance is supposedly a place where everyone can come together. They have no knowledge of their socioeconomic, racial, or ethnic status or anything like that, or religion. So they come together and they make these principles in order to be fair to everyone, because they might end up in a situation where they need health care. So because of this, you can see how the government should operate on these principles, because they allow for the disadvantaged in society to be most well prepared or protected for the world. Because if you are born naturally to a disadvantaged class, you don't have any control over that. And it's not your fault that you may die of starvation, or it's not your fault that you may die of a disease you contract. It's not, and whereas somebody who's born into an advantaged position may survive that disease. So because these principles of justice are created under the veil of ignorance, and the veil of ignorance is a state where nobody is aware of their current state in government. It's the most legitimate form of government you can make because it's created under the veil of ignorance. And for these reasons...
Now, the debate today boils down to, as my opponent said, government legitimacy. My opponent seems to think that a legitimate government is one that follows both of the two principles. She explained the equal liberty principle and the difference principle. And I have said that a legitimate government follows the social contract. Now, I would first like to start by contesting my opponent's idea of a legitimate government, because my opponent stated that the equal liberty principle is a scheme of liberties, and that on the negative side, we're failing to uphold the idea or the liberty of life. Yet this does not especially justify her own point, as she is still failing to uphold two of the three liberties. And under a government created with a social contract, it could still protect the right to life by defenses. Healthcare is not the only way that life can be protected, because when people go to create a government, they are doing so that individual people are not the judge of when we should punish someone for rights, because it doesn't seem very fair under the state of nature for people to just be their own judge and deem, oh, this person took my property, now I have the right to retaliate in any way I deem fit. That is simply not fair and does not follow either of her principles or uphold any of the rights I am stating. So therefore, people need to create this social contract so that their rights can be upheld. The government will decide when someone gets punished, or how to... the government will protect their rights so that no individual people are simply deciding when it is justified to punish another person for their action. And they can protect these rights by defensive measures, but little else, because anything else would be stepping up on the bounds of the rights that they were chosen to protect. And moving on to my opponent's side, she stated that the neg is failing to uphold life, and we need a compatibility of rights. And the neg isn't necessarily failing to uphold life simply because they refuse to have health care. People could pay for their own health care with their own property and choose to do so. Yet, the government is simply only tasked to protecting property, life, and liberty, and the government can do so by defensive measures and police forces, but beyond that, would simply be unjust to take the property and liberty of people. And my opponent failed to address how, on her own side, a single-payer system would not be upholding her own criterion of justice as fairness, because since it does not uphold both of the principles, it would fail to be a legitimate or moral government since it does not uphold the equal liberty principle. And she stated an example of education, yet education is simply outside the bounds of the government, and if it's taking the property of people and even giving it to others so as to educate them, it's still taking property away from people that they have worked for and labored for, and it does not have the right to do so. And now, another thing my opponent stated was that because a government is created under the veil of ignorance, then it is a legitimate government, because people don't know what situation they're going to be in. Yet, I don't see any real reason for this simply because they don't know where they're going to be in. It's a legitimate government. That's not what a legitimate government would do, is violate the rights of its people so it can simply do whatever people would agree upon if they didn't know where they were going to be in society. If people were in a society without a government, they would want to join a government so that their rights would be protected. They wouldn't simply go, I think it would be best if we do this, just in case I am put in this specific circumstance. They would want to join a government as to protect their property and their rights, since in the state of nature there would be no protection of rights. And therefore, since the negative system adheres to the social contract and protects the three rights of life, liberty, and property, then it would be a legitimate government. And as I have shown, my opponent's government that employs a single-payer system would not necessarily be a legitimate government because it fails to uphold her own established principles and fails to protect two of the three rights that I have established. And simply because one has healthcare doesn't necessarily ensure that people necessarily always have their rights protected. And that is why the negative system would have a more legitimate and moral government.
Okay. So the round comes down to, again, a question of government legitimacy. The veil of ignorance, or any policy created under the veil of ignorance, is legitimate because people need a way to be protected if they are born into a position that doesn't allow that for them. So again, we have an obligation as people to look after others. If someone is drowning, you're going to go and save them. And I would posit that because because the government is made up of people, we have an obligation as a people to protect others, even if that does include or necessitate a minor infringement on liberty or property rights. My opponent, his main argument against my case is that the equal liberty principle denies property and liberty, and that I'm only looking after the one main right. Again, I deny this because the equal liberty principle, as it states, everyone has basic rights compatible with the same scheme of rights for others. Compatibility may include small infringements of rights if that means taxation upon the other people in order to provide for the right to life for other people. If we remember when I told you back in the AC how the disparities between the disparities seen in minority groups is very large. What if you were born into that position? Wouldn't you want, under the veil of ignorance, if you didn't know that you were going to be born into that position, so almost the fear of that propels you to create a policy that would allow for you to be protected under, or if that actually happens, you were born into that natural position with that natural disadvantage. So we can see how a government is legitimate if it takes that idea into consideration when it creates a policy for its citizens. Also, my opponent, I ignored the idea of tacit consent, so this is going to be one of my voting issues. Tacit consent, when you decide you want to drive or you're going to be part of a society. My opponent doesn't take that into consideration when he develops his case. So say, again, when you form part of society, you have an obligation to provide for the others in society because that's the rights that you are protecting. Healthcare comes along with the right to life, something my opponent doesn't look for or doesn't provide for in his case. So if you agree to exercise the protection of society, then protection includes healthcare so that your right to life is not unfairly transgressed because of your natural position in society. That's what the government, or that's what the Brown boils down to in this case. And so because we can look at that and we can say, okay, we must provide for others' right to life, we can see how a single-payer healthcare system, how the government has a moral obligation to implement that.